Welcome to day 19 of our 30 Days of Insurance and Risk Management vlog. This is Matthew Struck with Treadstone Risk Management, and today we're talking about fitness for duty and functional capacity exams. So a lot of workers' comp claims and injuries just kind of get rehabbed pretty easily, and they're taken care of, and the employee gets back to work. But some of them are a little bit more involved, and they take a little bit more scrutiny or testing to make sure that the employee can come back to full duty and be able to perform their duties and do it safely. So we're going to look at these two tools as it relates to those more complex cases. The first thing I'm going to tell you is that both of them are distinctively different, and they can be used for the same purposes from time to time, but they also can be used for extremely different purposes, and we'll get into that in a bit. So what exactly are fitness for duty and functional capacity exams? Well, a fitness for duty exam is done with an examiner, with a physician, and typically they sit down with the employee, but prior to sitting down with the employee, they'll do a full review of the employee's medical records as it relates to their rehabilitation from their workers' comp injury. And the other thing that they're going to do is they're going to look at the job duties or the job description that you've provided them to make sure that the rehabilitation that they've gone through and the level of rehabilitation that they've achieved lines up with what their day-to-day job duties are. And so a large number of employees are going to be able to get back to close to 100% or 100% of what they were before the injury and be able to resume their job duties without any issues. But there's probably a handful of employees that they end up going through their rehabilitation, they don't get back to 100%, and then the question becomes, can this employee perform their job duties when they come back, and can they do it safely? Are they restricted from what they could lift? If they have lifting activities, is that going to cause their back injury to become re-injured or to worsen? Fitness for duty is also used in cases where an employee might be able to be allowed back early before their rehabilitation is completed, so they might still be going through physical therapy or some other level of treatment, but there might be an opportunity to get them back to work full duty, doing 100% of their job duties prior to that rehab process being completed without hindering the rehabilitation. So typically your examiner, your physician, is going to be looking at the various documentation and then talking to the employee and giving their assessment as to whether or not that employee can then come back to their position without any concerns. So a functional capacity examination is a little bit different. Functional capacity examination is a little bit more technological. Typically it's done with the employee in front of a camera, and they use little kind of markers on the employee's body, at their joints and other points on their body, to actually track how the employee moves, whether it be walking, running, lifting, stretching, and they're really kind of looking at how the employee's body is moving and whether or not they're compensating or if pain is causing them to have very poor technique when it comes to these various job duties. So they're going to use your job description as well, but they're going to use it to set up these tests, because if your job description says must be able to lift 25 pounds, for instance, they're actually going to have a box that's 20 or 25 pounds, and then they're going to ask the employee on camera to lift it to a certain height and see whether or not they're able to do it without compensating. And so anyone who's had a knee injury understands this. A lot of times when you compensate, so if you injure one part of your body and for a prolonged period of time you're compensating by putting more weight on another part of your body or moving in a different way, you can actually end up with the same injury or another injury in a different part of your body. So with knee injuries, a lot of times you might injure your right knee, but then over time your left knee ends up developing an injury because you've kind of compensated or changed the way that you do things, and it's not always conscious. It could be a subconscious change. So a functional capacity examination is just that. It's a very technical exam, and it can be very kind of black and white, but there can also be some gray area in terms of whether or not that exam is showing the full performance of the employee or whether or not there's some discrepancy there. Okay, so what are some of the benefits of both of these exams that can be done? The first of which is it gives you reasonable certainty that when you accept an employee back from workers' comp injury, they're going to be able to perform their job and they're going to be able to do it safely without any risk of harming themselves or others while they're completing their duties. It's also going to allow you to identify employees that might be manufacturing symptoms, meaning they might want to stay out on workers' comp longer, or they might be kind of jockeying for position to get a better settlement if they filed a legal claim to try and get some kind of payment for permanent disability associated with their injury. And so a functional capacity exam specifically is really geared towards seeing whether or not that employee is truly changed from a physical standpoint, or whether or not they're changing it consciously to kind of reach an end that isn't necessarily the truth or truthful in the way that they're performing their duties. A fitness for duty or functional capacity exam also allows you to reset the baseline that you established if you did a pre-employment physical, meaning when they were hired, if they did a pre-employment physical, you kind of had a reasonable idea of what their physical state was when they got hired. After a workers' comp injury, if you do one of these exams, it now gives you an updated point in time, a more current point in time, to look at their physical abilities or their physical state to make sure that you know how they are physically going forward. And that's going to have a couple of knock-on effects, the biggest of which is when it comes to those litigated claims or those allegations that a certain job duty worsened a health condition, or they had worsening health conditions as a result of their workers' comp injury. This gives you a new baseline to work off of to judge whether or not you actually think that's true. It's also going to further breed a work culture of accountability. These exams are going to be thorough, and they are going to make sure to give notice to the workforce that you're not just going to be able to tell me that you're having an issue and I'm just going to take it on faith. We all want to believe our employees. We all want to assume that they're being 100% truthful, but the problem is that there's a handful of them that might not be. And as a result of that, that can be very costly. It can cost you in terms of dollars, it can cost you in terms of employee morale and productivity. So this gives you the ability to kind of really upfront show that you're kind of holding them to task, so to speak, when it comes to that feedback and their communication when it comes to their rehab or their physical state. It memorializes the basis for not bringing an injured employee back to work. So in a lot of states, you don't necessarily have to accept an employee back to work after a workers' comp injury. New Jersey is an at-will state, so barring some other kind of agreement or contract, like a collective bargaining agreement, you might not necessarily have to accept that employee back. Well, you could arbitrarily make that choice, in which case you're probably going to get sued for wrongful termination, whether or not there's grounds or not. But these exams give you some kind of factual evidence or tangible evidence to say this is what part of what we drew our conclusion off of to take administrative action and not accept the employee back and actually release them from their job duties. This also helps you to avoid subsequent injuries. So in normal circumstances, if an employee is welcome back to work 100% of their duties and assuming that they're fully healthy to perform them, if they really aren't, they could end up injuring themselves again. And typically the first injury might be bad. The second injury is usually way worse for a multitude of factors. First of all, they're weaker, and so the way that they compensated earlier to try and mitigate the injury or the damage to their body isn't necessarily available there. And so, if they've had one back injury that was, minor to moderate, the second one's probably going to be really bad just because of their physical state has changed from, the time of the first injury to the second. It's also going to help you avoid injuries from the standpoint of understanding their level of disability, and if they have to change roles or have to change duties or job positions, you're going to be able to better place them in a position that's not going to put them at harm because they have certain limitations that are still left over from an on-the-job injury. All right, so let's talk about some best practices. So in terms of creating a guideline or a policy for your HR level or your supervisor level employees that are going to be making the determination or communicating with your claims professional and your risk management professional to determine whether or not they should employ these tools, you should have it written out. There should be some, it can't be too strict because you're never going to be able to think up all of the potential situations in which you might need to use it, but it should have some general guidelines associated with when to use it and how to use these tools. You should also make sure to be consistent. So if you're going to memorialize it in a program or in a plan and it's going to be implemented, it needs to be implemented consistently, because if you don't, you're going to end up with a harassment or a discrimination claim that alleges that you are specifically targeting an employee by putting them through all this testing while you didn't do it for another employee that had maybe a similar circumstance. Make sure to pinpoint the timing of these exams. It can be very crucial. So you never want to use one of these exams if this employee is going through their rehabilitative process and they're nowhere close to being 100% or reaching what most physical professionals would call maximum medical improvement, or MMI. If they're nowhere close to that, don't have these tests done and don't draw any conclusions or take any administrative action, because that's also going to open you up to a lawsuit, and it's going to cause all kinds of issues that you really don't want to incur the legal expense of going down that rabbit hole. Use the information that's obtained from these exams as part of the decision-making process, not all of it. So like I said before, some of these exams, some of the results of the exams can be a little bit of a gray area. There's not always going to be absolute conclusions that are drawn. So this can't be the end-all be-all as far as why you made the decision. There has to be other things that lead up to it, such as the job duties that were performed beforehand, whether or not the employee was written up for doing things unsafely, whether or not the exam showed something that's questionable, and you're going to write down that you're worried that the employee's safety is at risk, and so you're going to make an administrative decision because there's no definitive evidence that they'd be able to come back and do things safely and not injure themselves. Utilize a testing facility that has a good pedigree for doing these tests and has the proper facilities, or utilize an occupational physician to do a fitness for duty examination that has a track record of understanding occupational risks and occupational health. If you don't, you run the risk of having the testing invalidated when it comes to a court. And also, make sure that when they give you the final conclusions, that there's actually some meat to it, that there's actually some definitive conclusions that are drawn. There might be some gray areas, which doesn't necessarily have to be a big problem. But when there are definitive conclusions that can be drawn, make sure you hold them to task, that they're actually writing those conclusions down at the end of the report. Finally, as a result of these tests, if you are going to make any kind of administrative change or take administrative action as far as releasing an employee or changing their job status or their job position, make sure to consult your attorney, your labor attorney, because if you don't, like I said before, you could end up with a much greater issue that brings you down a rabbit hole of just dumping money after an employment practices claim or an employment liability claim, where it's alleged that you took your action unlawfully or in violation of some regulation or in a discriminatory fashion. So make sure to employ your attorney when it comes time to make that decision, so that they can give you feedback on whether you should or not, as well as if you are going to take that action, what steps you need to take leading up to it to protect yourself. So that's the end of day 19, talking about fitness for duty examinations and functional capacity examinations. There's some other resources that I've linked in the video notes and in the full form blog post, so make sure to take advantage of those and check them out. Please, if you like this content, if you got something out of it, subscribe, hit like, share it, comment, ask us questions, or give us feedback on the material and how it's delivered, and we're going to keep sending it out there. So we're looking forward to it. Thank you for joining us. See you on day 20.